Registrar Thekmore had processed 17,000 applications in his 40-year tenure at the Catherian Military Academy, and he prided himself on never being surprised. Applications from the crystalline Zephyrians who communicated through harmonic frequencies. Routine. Requests from the hive-minded Kolari seeking individual officer training. Unusual, but manageable. Even the occasional inquiry from those pretentious Altarian nobles who thought their family crests qualified as military experience. Predictably irritating, but hardly shocking. The datapad in his 6-fingered hands, however, was trying very hard to give him what his species called a cerebral malfunction. Origin world. Earth. He read aloud to his empty office, his vocal sacs deflating slightly. Classification, Sol 3, Sector, Weight. He checked the classification database, though he already knew what he'd find. Class Tobuturth, Hazard World. The designation that made recruiting officers change subjects and seasoned Marines develop sudden interests in paperwork. Earth wasn't just dangerous. It was the cosmic equivalent of a military training ground designed by a committee of sadists with unlimited budgets and no oversight. The application continued with casual indifference to galactic common sense. Applicant seeks enrollment in Advanced Tactical Leadership Program. Previous experience includes survival training in local environment. Local environment, Thekmore muttered, pulling up Earth's profile. The first line made his secondary stomach clench. Atmospheric composition includes free oxygen at concentrations lethal to most carbon-based life forms. He didn't need to read further. Everyone knew the stories. His office door chimed, and Commander Vexhai entered without waiting for permission. A privilege earned through 30 years of turning soft civilian species into functional military officers. Problem, Registrar? Vexhai's translator rendered his Kimnari, clicking into standard Galactic with typical efficiency. Define problem. Thekmore rotated the datapad toward his superior. I have an application from a human. Vexhai's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep concentration or impending violence. With Kimnari, the distinction was often academic. A human. Applied here. Apparently. To our academy. So it would seem. The academy where last year's survival course killed 2 Braktari commandos. The very same. Vexhai's mandibles clicked rapidly. Definitely agitation, then. Have you verified this isn't some elaborate interspecies prank? The Altarians have been insufferable since they swept the strategy games. Thekmore had already checked. The application bore proper authentication seals, biometric verification, and most convincingly, a complete indifference to proper diplomatic channels. A fake application would have included flowery language about cultural exchange and mutual understanding. This one simply stated requirements and expected compliance. Credentials appear legitimate, he said carefully, though that raises additional concerns. Such as? The applicant claims proficiency in multi-environmental combat scenarios, resource scarcity management, and hostile fauna negotiation. Hostile fauna negotiation? Vexhai leaned forward. What does that even mean? I'm afraid to ask. Thekmore scrolled down. It gets worse. Educational background includes something called Wilderness Survival Certification and Emergency Medical Training. The wilderness survival was apparently recreational. The silence stretched long enough for Thekmore to hear the building's air recyclers cycling. Finally, Vexhai spoke with the careful tone of someone trying not to think too hard about what they were saying. The human considers survival training recreational. Evidently. On Earth. One assumes. The planet where the atmosphere can dissolve most known armor alloys. Well, that's just the rain. The atmosphere itself merely supports combustion at temperatures that liquefy most metals. Vexhi's translator made a sound like grinding gears, probably censoring whatever his actual response was. Have you contacted the Terran embassy? They're unavailable. Thekmor had tried. The embassy's response had been a pre-recorded message explaining that humans who sought off-world education were considered sufficiently motivated to handle their own arrangements. The recording had sounded amused. What's the applicant's stated reason for seeking admission? Thekmor scrolled to the final section. Academic interest in comparative tactical methodologies, and he paused, reading it twice to make sure. Seeking educational environment with reasonable challenge levels. Reasonable challenge levels. Vexhi's voice had gone flat. The Catherian Military Academy, where we pride ourselves on pushing the finest warriors in the galaxy to their absolute limits, represents reasonable challenge levels to a human. Apparently, she finds her homeworld's educational system excessively demanding. That stopped Vexhi entirely. His translator went silent for a full 30 seconds. She, he said finally. Female applicant, yes. A human female finds Earth's education system too challenging, so she's applying to the institution that broke the Thaxarian warlords. In summary, yes. Vexhi stood abruptly and walked to the window overlooking the Academy's main courtyard, where current cadets were running obstacle courses that had been designed by committee input from 12 different warrior cultures. 3 separate species were currently receiving medical attention. What are her test scores? Thekmor had hoped to avoid this part. Perfect marks on tactical reasoning, strategic planning, and resource allocation. And physical assessments? She submitted video documentation of her fitness standards. Thekmor had watched it once and immediately archived it in restricted files. I recommend you don't review it unless you want to requisition new training equipment. That bad? She used our obstacle course specifications as a warm-up routine. Vexhi's reflection in the window showed all 4 eyes had gone wide. Processing error? I ran diagnostics 3 times. Another long pause. In the courtyard below, a squad of Heptari cadets, whose species had evolved from predators that could bench press small vehicles, were struggling with what the Academy considered a moderate endurance challenge. Deny the application, Vexhi said finally. On what grounds? Find some. Thekmor pulled up the relevant regulations. Academic qualifications, exceeds requirements, physical capabilities, exceed requirements, psychological evaluation, indicates unusual stress resistance and adaptive thinking. He kept reading. Medical clearance states that applicant has survived standard Earth adolescence and is therefore cleared for any environmental challenges we might provide. Standard Earth adolescence. Vexhi turned back from the window. That's a medical qualification now? According to Terran Medical Services, yes. They include a note explaining that anyone who survives to 18 on Earth without significant psychological damage is considered suitable for military service in any known galactic conflict zone. Any known conflict zone. Their words. Vexhi sat down heavily. When does she arrive? 3 standard days. And there's no legal precedent for refusing her admission? None. The Academy Charter explicitly states that any being capable of meeting our standards may apply, regardless of species or origin. The founders probably never imagined someone from a Class 12 hazard world would want to. Or be capable of it. They sat in contemplative silence, both staring at the application that was about to upend 40 years of military education. Finally, Vexhi sighed, a sound like hydraulics releasing pressure. Inform the medical staff to stock additional trauma supplies. Already done. Alert the instructors that we'll need to recalibrate some training protocols. Which ones? All of them, probably. Vexai stood again. And Registrar? Yes, Commander? Start drafting our insurance claims now. Something tells me we're going to need them. As the door closed behind his superior, Thekmore looked at the application one more time. At the bottom, in the section reserved for additional comments, the human had written just 4 words: looking forward to relaxing. He decided not to mention that part to anyone. Some things were too terrifying to share. Cadet Quinn stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately noticed how thin the air felt. Not dangerously thin, just lacking that pleasant bite of atmospheric pressure that made breathing feel like an accomplishment. The gravity was lighter, too, probably around 0.7 standard, which explained why everyone else moved with the careful deliberation of people afraid. They might accidentally launch themselves into orbit. She shouldered her single duffel bag and followed the stream of new arrivals toward the dormitory complex, noting with professional interest how the other species had packed. The Zephyrian cadet beside her floated a crystalline storage unit that probably weighed more than Quinn's entire belongings. Behind them, a group of Kalari moved in perfect synchronization, their luggage arranged in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. Excessive much? Quinn muttered, earning a few curious stares from universal translators trying to parse human idiom. The dormitory assignment process went smoothly until Quinn reached the housing coordinator, a Velthani whose purple skin had gone distinctly lavender upon seeing her species classification. "You'll be in Block 7, Suite 12C, the coordinator said, her voice carefully neutral. "Your roommate is Cadet Jex from the Andromedy sector. She specifically requested someone durable." Define durable. Someone unlikely to require emergency medical intervention during normal social interaction. Quinn raised an eyebrow, but decided not to ask for elaboration. She found Suite 12C without incident, though she did notice that other cadets in the hallway gave her a surprisingly wide berth for beings who'd presumably chosen military careers. Her roommate turned out to be a 7-foot-tall reptilian creature with scales that shifted color based on emotional state, currently a nervous yellow-green. Jex was methodically unpacking what appeared to be half a medical supply depot. "You must be the human," Jex said without looking up. Her scales flickered toward orange. "I brought extra coagulant." "That's thoughtful, but I'm not planning to bleed on anything." "Plans change rapidly around humans, or so I'm told." Jex finally met her eyes. "Your species has quite the reputation." Quinn flopped onto her assigned bunk, a reinforced platform that could probably support a small vehicle. "Let me guess. Bloodthirsty savages who eat their enemies and bathe in violence?" "Worse. You're supposedly reasonable until suddenly you're not, and by then it's too late for everyone involved." Jex's scales had settled into a thoughtful blue-gray. "The senior cadets have a betting pool on how long you'll last." "What are the odds?" "Most money is on dies during orientation week. A few optimists are betting you make it to first combat simulation." "Anyone betting I graduate?" "One cadet put down credits on you not just graduating, but somehow making the rest of us look inadequate in the process." Jex's scales shifted to amused green. We all assumed he was joking. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their suitemates, a methane-breathing Gaxorian who communicated through bioluminescent patterns, and a Threni whose species had evolved from pack hunters with an unfortunate tendency toward anxiety disorders. "Introductions," announced the Threni, Cadet Merix, with the forced enthusiasm of someone trying very hard not to think about mortality statistics. "I'm from Threnar Prime, where we specialize in coordinated tactical strikes and psychological warfare." The Gaxorian's patterns translated as Cadet Voss, Deep Space Reconnaissance, Pleased to make your acquaintance and hoping to survive the experience. Quinn. Earth. She didn't elaborate. The silence that followed was the special kind of quiet that meant everyone was suddenly very aware of their own breathing. "So," Mirek said eventually, "what's Earth like?" "Pretty standard, really. Mostly harmless." Quinn started unpacking her few belongings. "Though I guess it depends on where you live." "Where did you live?" Jex asked. "Northern Australia. Small town called Darwin." Voss's bioluminescent patterns flickered rapidly, probably checking a database. The result made their light patterns stutter with what the translator rendered as concerned confusion. "Your settlement was named after a theorist who studied survival adaptation?" "Yeah, Chuck Darwin. Nice guy, according to history class. Had some interesting ideas about how life adapts to challenging environments." "And you found this environment standard?" Mirex's tail was twitching, a species-specific stress indicator. "Well, you have to watch out for the crocodiles, obviously, and the jellyfish. Oh, and spider season can be rough if you're not careful." Quinn pulled out her toiletry kit. "But honestly, once you learn to check your boots for funnel webs and avoid swimming during stinger season, it's pretty relaxed." The universal translators worked overtime processing terms they'd apparently never encountered. Jex's scales had gone a color Quinn was pretty sure wasn't on their emotional spectrum chart. "Define spider season," Jex said carefully. "You know, when the huntsmen start migrating, dinner plate-sized arachnids looking for new territory, mostly harmless unless you surprise them, but they can jump pretty far when startled." Quinn shrugged. "My little brother used to collect them." "Collect them?" Voss's patterns had gone strobing. "As in, capture and retain?" "Yeah, he had like 30 in terrariums. Mom made him keep them in the garage after one got loose and startled the postman." Quinn grinned at the memory. "Poor guy fell off his bike trying to get away from what was basically a fuzzy dinner plate with legs." Mireks made a sound like a kettle whistling. "Your family cohabitated with 30 predatory arachnids?" "They're not really predatory toward humans. More like enthusiastic about personal space." Quinn pulled out her bedding. "The redbacks are the ones you have to worry about. Those'll actually try to kill you." "And you lived alongside creatures actively attempting homicide?" "Well, you don't live alongside them. You just learn to coexist. Check before you sit, shake out your clothes, don't reach into dark spaces without looking first." Quinn fluffed her pillow. Standard earth cotton that had required special import permits. Basic survival stuff. The three aliens exchanged glances that somehow transcended species barriers. The universal look of beings who'd realized they might be sharing living space with someone whose definition of basic survival included dodging attempted murder on a daily basis. "What about the jellyfish?" Jex asked, with the tone of someone who suspected they didn't want to know. "Box jellies. Transparent, about the size of your head. Tentacles that can stretch 20 feet. Neurotoxin that'll drop most humans in minutes." Quinn sat on her bunk to test the spring tension. "Pretty to look at, though. Like floating glass sculptures of death." "You describe them with admiration," Voss's patterns observed. "They're beautiful. Perfectly adapted killing machines that have remained essentially unchanged for millions of years." Quinn stretched. "You've got to respect that kind of evolutionary commitment to excellence." "You respect the creatures trying to kill you," Mirek said faintly. "Only the competent ones. The incompetent predators are just annoying." The suite fell silent again. Quinn looked around at her new roommates and realized she might have misjudged the conversation. "Look, it's not that bad. Most people make it to adulthood just fine. You just have to pay attention to your environment and think before you act." She grinned. That's why I figured military academy would be pretty straightforward. All this structured training in controlled conditions. It's like Earth on easy mode. Zex's scales had achieved a color that definitely wasn't in any known emotional spectrum. A sort of ultraviolet panic that suggested new evolutionary adaptations happening in real time. Earth on easy mode, she repeated. Right. No random venomous surprises, no weather trying to kill you, plenty of medical support standing by. Quinn looked around at the well-appointed dormitory. Plus, you get to know exactly what the threats are ahead of time instead of just stumbling into them. It's like having cheat codes for survival. Outside their window, the Academy's evening chimes began to sound, a pleasant melody designed to help cadets from different worlds synchronize their circadian rhythms. To Quinn, it sounded almost like a lullaby. To her roommates, it probably sounded like a funeral dirge. Senior instructor Krail Vash had designed the Meridian Force scenario specifically to break overconfident cadets. The simulation dropped small squads onto a hostile moon with limited supplies, aggressive native fauna, and environmental hazards calibrated to push each species to their psychological limits without quite killing them. In 15 years of running variations, he'd achieved a perfect balance of despair and educational value. He was therefore unprepared for Cadet Quinn's opening move. Scenario begins in 3, 2, 1, mark, he announced from the observation deck, watching as 6 teams of 4 cadets each materialized in the simulation's barren landscape. Most teams immediately began establishing defensive perimeters and conducting equipment inventories. Team Helix, led by a promising Kimneri cadet, started digging shelter trenches. Team Nova began synchronized reconnaissance patterns their Kolari training had drilled into genetic memory. Team Zulu, which included the human, started digging holes. "Instructor," called his assistant, a methodical Vektai named Torvin. "Team Zulu's tactical approach is unclear." Krelvash focused his attention on Quinn's squad. The human had somehow convinced her 3 teammates, including Zex, who developed an unhealthy fascination with human behavioral patterns, to excavate what appeared to be random pits across their designated area. "Cadet Quinn," Krelvash activated the communication channel. "Explain your tactical reasoning." "Sir, establishing concealed positions for passive fauna redirection while gathering intelligence on local ecosystem patterns," came the reply. That sounded almost reasonable, except for one problem. "Cadet, you're digging pit traps." "Affirmative, sir, though I prefer to think of them as behavioral modification stations." Krelvash muted his microphone and turned to Torvin. "She's treating a military simulation like pest control." "Perhaps we should observe the results before intervening," Torvin suggested, with the diplomatic caution of someone who'd read Quinn's file. The first test came 20 minutes later when the simulation released its signature challenge, a pack of 6-legged predators with armored hides and what the Academy generously classified as territorial aggression issues. These creatures had been programmed to assault defensive positions with coordinated pack tactics, forcing cadets to demonstrate combat effectiveness while managing resources and maintaining unit cohesion. Team Helix responded with suppressive fire and tactical withdrawal. Team Nova executed a complex flanking maneuver that would have impressed military theorists. Quinn's team caught half the pack in holes and started a barbecue with the other half. "She's cooking them?" Krelvash watched in fascination as smoke began rising from Team Zulu's position. "According to her biometric readings, she's preparing a meal," Torvin confirmed. "Her stress indicators remain completely baseline." "During active combat?" "She doesn't appear to classify this as combat. Her neural patterns suggest she views it as routine foraging." The other teams were struggling with the scenario's secondary challenge, resource depletion. Their emergency rations were calculated to last precisely long enough to complete the mission objectives, forcing difficult decisions about energy expenditure and risk assessment. Quinn's team was apparently having a feast. How is she feeding 4 cadets from creatures that are primarily cartilage and defensive plating? Krelvash demanded. She's extracted approximately 40% more nutritional value than our xenobiology department calculated was theoretically possible, Torvin reported. Also, she appears to be seasoning the food with local plant matter. Local plant matter that hasn't been tested for toxicity. Her team's medical readings remain nominal. In fact, Cadet Jex reports improved digestion. Krelvash pulled up the planetary database. Those plants contain alkaloids that should cause severe gastric distress in most known species. Perhaps human digestive systems process them differently. Or perhaps she's slowly poisoning her entire squad. The simulation's final challenge activated at the 6-hour mark. Environmental degradation, designed to simulate equipment failure during hostile weather. Temperature regulation failed, atmospheric processors went offline, and communication systems experienced cascade failures that left teams isolated and desperate. Team Zulu built a sauna. "Instructor," Torvin said carefully, "I believe the human has modified our environmental controls." "Modified how?" "She's created a geothermal heating system using the simulation's underground thermal vents and some kind of improvised heat exchange mechanism built from disassembled equipment." "She disassembled her survival equipment?" "Only the redundant components. According to her technical specifications, she's improved overall system efficiency by 37%. Krelvash activated direct communication to Quinn's position. "Cadet, you were specifically instructed not to modify issued equipment." "Sir, I interpreted that as not to modify it destructively. This is constructive modification that enhances operational capability." "You built a heating system from survival gear?" "Affirmative, sir. Also a water purification system, improved shelter insulation, and what my grandmother would have called a reasonable substitute for proper tools." "Your grandmother?" "Yes, sir. She used to say that anyone who couldn't make something useful out of random junk hadn't been paying attention during childhood." "What did your grandmother do for a living, Cadet?" "Ran a cattle station in the outback, sir. 200,000 hectares of what most people would consider uninhabitable wilderness." "And she taught you equipment modification?" "Among other things, sir, though she mostly focused on practical applications of available resources for extended duration independent operations." Krelvash muted his microphone again. "Her grandmother was running survival training exercises disguised as childhood education." "It appears to have been effective," Torvin observed. "By hour 12, the other teams were experiencing exactly the psychological pressure Krelvash had designed the scenario to create. Resource anxiety, environmental stress, and tactical uncertainty combined to push cadets toward their breaking points. The crucial moment when training either crystallized into competence or shattered into panic. Team Zulu was playing games. "What kind of games?" Krelvash asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know. "They appear to be conducting competitive challenges involving accuracy, endurance, and creative problem-solving," Torvin reported. "Cadet Quinn has introduced what she terms skill-building exercises that her teammates find engaging." "During a survival scenario?" "They've completed all mission objectives and established sustainable resource management protocols. The remaining time is apparently being used for what the human calls professional development." "Professional development. She's teaching them advanced wilderness techniques." Krelvash brought up the mission parameters. Team Zulu had indeed completed every objective, but they'd done so using methodologies that weren't in any tactical manual. They'd achieved resource security through ecosystem integration rather than conservation. They'd established communications through improvised technology rather than equipment management. They demonstrated unit cohesion through shared problem-solving rather than command hierarchy. Instructor, Torvin said quietly, the other teams are requesting permission to observe Team Zulu's techniques. Why? Because Team Zulu is succeeding at challenges that are defeating everyone else, and their stress indicators suggest they're enjoying the experience. They're enjoying Meridian to 4. Cadet Quinn appears to consider it relaxing. Her teammates are adapting to her methods and reporting improved confidence in their capabilities. Krelvash stared at his displays. In 15 years of running this simulation, he'd never had a team request extended time in the scenario. Teams begged for extraction. They celebrated completion. They definitely didn't ask to stay longer. "Sir," came Quinn's voice over the communication channel. "Permission to request scenario extension." "Extension? Cadet, this is a survival test, not a recreational facility." "Understood, sir, but my team has identified several ecosystem variables we'd like to study further. Also, Cadet Voss has expressed interest in learning more advanced shelter construction techniques." "Advanced shelter construction?" "Yes, sir. Basic underground thermal management systems. Very practical for deep space reconnaissance work." Krelvash looked at his assistant. "She's turned our most challenging simulation into a technical education seminar." "More concerning," Torvin added. "She's succeeding. Her team's performance metrics exceed every baseline we've established." "And the other teams?" "Requesting transfer to Quinn's methodology immediately upon extraction." Krelvash closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining this to the Academy Board. Their most sophisticated training scenario had been reduced to what amounted to a human-led camping trip, where everyone learned useful life skills and bonded over shared accomplishments. "Simulation terminated," he announced. "All teams report to debriefing immediately." "Sir," Quinn's voice came back, "could we possibly run this scenario again sometime? My teammates found it quite educational, and I think there's room for improvement in our resource utilization efficiency." "Improvement," Krelvash repeated faintly. "Yes, sir. We only managed to turn the scenario parameters into a sustainable long-term habitat. With proper planning, we could probably make it comfortable." Krelvash began drafting his report and wondered if the Academy's insurance policies covered total paradigm reconstruction. The Catherian Academy's graduation ceremony traditionally celebrated the transformation of promising cadets into competent officers. This year's ceremony was being broadcast across 17 star systems, primarily because the betting pools had reached economically significant proportions, and 3 separate news networks had purchased exclusive rights to witness either spectacular failure or unprecedented success. Commandant Yextal adjusted her ceremonial plumage and surveyed the assembled dignitaries with the resignation of someone who'd spent 4 years rewriting institutional policy on a weekly basis. The human cadet had forced revisions to safety protocols, tactical doctrine, survival training methodology, equipment standards, resource allocation theory, and most recently, the definition of impossible itself. "Distinguished guests," she began, her voice carrying across the amphitheater. "Today we recognize the achievements of candidates who have demonstrated exceptional dedication to military excellence." In the front row, Quinn sat with perfect military posture, while her classmates around her displayed varying degrees of what psychologists would later classify as grateful survivor syndrome. Jex's scales had settled into a permanent bronze shade that hadn't existed in reptilian emotional literature before Quinn's arrival. Cadet Voss had developed bioluminescent patterns so complex they required new translation protocols. Even the Kalari hive mind representatives had started exhibiting individual personality quirks, an evolutionary development that was making xenobiologists very excited and very confused. "This graduating class has achieved remarkable innovations in tactical adaptation," the Commandant continued, "including revolutionary approaches to resource management, environmental integration, and what our instructors have termed constructive impossibility. That last phrase had been Commander Vexhigh's contribution, coined after Quinn's final examination involved her successfully defending a position that military theorists had mathematically proven was indefensible. She'd done it by changing the mathematical assumptions, which had prompted an academy-wide review of whether mathematics itself was sufficiently advanced to evaluate human tactical thinking. "We particularly recognize Cadet Quinn," Yextal announced, "whose unique perspective has enriched our understanding of adaptive problem-solving under extreme conditions." The applause was polite, if slightly nervous. Quinn had graduated first in her class, primarily because the Academy had run out of challenging scenarios after she'd optimized their entire training catalog into what she consistently described as pretty straightforward stuff. As tradition demanded, the valedictorian was invited to address the assembly. Quinn approached the podium with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent 4 years inadvertently traumatizing military professionals. "Thank you, Commandant. Distinguished guests, faculty, fellow graduates," she began. "I'd like to thank the Academy for providing such a supportive learning environment." In the faculty section, Instructor Krelvash made a sound like hydraulics failing. His hair had gone completely white during Quinn's second year, specifically after she'd suggested improvements to the Academy's advanced psychological warfare curriculum based on techniques her high school debate team had used. "When I first applied here," Quinn continued, "I was honestly just looking for somewhere I could focus on academics without all the usual distractions. I'm pleased to report that the Academy exceeded my expectations." Registrar Techmore, whose stress management medication dosage had tripled since Quinn's enrollment, wondered what exactly constituted usual distractions in human educational systems. He'd stopped trying to investigate after Quinn's casual reference to exam week had prompted nightmares about educational methodologies that made military training look recreational. "I've learned valuable lessons about leadership, teamwork, and the importance of adapting your communication style to work effectively with diverse perspectives," Quinn said. "My classmates taught me that what seems obvious to one species might be revolutionary thinking to another." What she'd actually learned was that describing routine problem-solving techniques could cause senior military officers to require medical intervention, but Quinn had developed diplomatic skills during her time at the Academy. "I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to participate in the Academy's exchange program with civilian institutions," she continued. "Next semester, I'll be attending the Altarian Institute of Advanced Theoretical Studies to pursue graduate research in comparative educational methodology." The audience's reaction was immediate and profound. The Altarian delegation in the VIP section went rigid with what appeared to be existential dread. The Institute was famous throughout the galaxy for its rigorous academic standards, intellectual challenges so demanding that they made the Catherian Academy's training look like recreational activities. Quinn had applied there because she'd heard their theoretical physics program was reasonably challenging. "I'm particularly excited about their doctoral program in applied xenopsychology," she added, cheerfully. "From what I understand, they're doing fascinating research into how different species respond to stress, adapt to challenging environments, and develop problem-solving strategies under resource constraints." In the faculty section, Commander Vexhigh was performing rapid calculations in his head. If the Academy's training represented easy mode for Quinn, and she considered the Altarian Institute merely reasonably challenging, then her homeworld's educational system existed somewhere beyond the conventional scale of academic difficulty. "I'm also looking forward to their fieldwork requirements," Quinn continued. "Apparently, doctoral candidates conduct independent research in what they classify as intellectually demanding environments. It sounds like a nice change of pace from structured coursework." The Altarian delegate who'd been tasked with recruiting Quinn was now exhibiting symptoms that the Academy's medical staff recognized as Quinn-induced cognitive restructuring, the psychological condition that occurred when beings realized their entire understanding of difficulty scales had been fundamentally inadequate. "Before I conclude," Quinn said, "I'd like to share something my little brother told me before I left Earth. He said I was crazy for choosing the easy option instead of staying home for university. At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic." The assembly had gone completely silent. Even the building's environmental systems seemed to be holding their breath. "But after 4 years here, I'm starting to think he might have had a point. The Academy's challenges were certainly educational, but they were also quite manageable once you understood the underlying principles." She smiled with genuine warmth. "I suspect my brother was right about this being the relaxing choice." "This was the relaxing choice," someone in the audience repeated faintly. "So I want to thank my family for encouraging me to take some time away from home to focus on my studies without the usual academic pressure. It's been exactly the kind of low-stress environment I needed to develop my potential." Quinn stepped back from the podium to thunderous silence, which gradually transformed into the kind of applause that occurs when people aren't sure what they've just witnessed, but suspect it was historically significant. As the ceremony concluded and guests began filing toward the reception, Commandant Yextal approached Registrar Tekmor with the expression of someone who'd been professionally humbled by cosmic forces beyond their comprehension. "Registrar," she said quietly, "I want you to flag Quinn's file for permanent archive status." "Any particular reason, Commandant?" "Future military historians are going to want documentation of the cadet who attended our academy as a stress relief vacation from her homeworld's educational system." Yextal looked towards the reception area, where Quinn was cheerfully explaining to horrified Altarian academics why she thought their doctoral program sounded refreshingly straightforward. "Also," the Commandant added, "send a priority message to the Galactic Educational Accreditation Board. I think we need to establish new difficulty classifications." "New classifications, Commandant?" "Anything above our current standards apparently qualifies as normal Tuesday afternoon on Earth." She straightened her ceremonial plumage and walked toward the reception with the measured dignity of someone who'd learned that the universe contained forms of casual competence that defied institutional understanding. Behind her, Tekmor made a note to update Quinn's permanent record with a final addendum. "Recommended for immediate deployment to any situation the galaxy considers impossible. Also recommended for immediate deployment away from any situation the galaxy considers survivable." Some assessments, he reflected, wrote themselves,